Welcome to the Carousel of Happiness Podcast. I'm your host, Allie Wagner. On our last episode, we introduced you to the town of Nederland, Colorado, where the Carousel of Happiness is located. You learned how a town 17 miles away from Boulder, Colorado can feel like a world away, and how in many ways Nederland is the perfect home for the Carousel of Happiness. And don't worry, if you feel like you don't quite understand Ned, you're not alone. Our town might be small in size, but it is big in depth and complexity. You'll hear more about Nederland as we move through the podcast together. The town and the carousel are interwoven in such a way, we just can't help it. For today's episode, the original plan was to tell you more about how in 2008 or so, the town of Nederland stepped in and helped Scott and his newly formed nonprofit organization raise over $600,000 to build the carousel building and finish carousel restoration. And they did it in all sorts of fun ways. They held fairy tea parties and art auctions and massage-a-thons. Some folks made money recycling cans and donated the profits. Others, like the architect that designed the building, donated their much-needed and very expensive services. We had folks donate their time, their money, their expertise, and their skills, all to help Scott's idea over the finish line. But we're not going to talk about that today. Not because it didn't happen or because it wasn't important, but because last week I could feel something was off with the podcast. It wasn't working. I tried to put this week's episode together and nothing was falling into place. Not the way it had in the first couple of episodes. I knew I needed to make a change, but I didn't know what. And then I had coffee with Scott and our colleague, Amy Hazelwood. And because of that conversation, I realized what was missing in those episodes. As a result of that conversation, I suddenly understood why the first couple of episodes in the podcast really worked much better than the last two. And consequently, I realized what we need to do to get the podcast back on track. And yes, you caught that right. I said we. You and me, dear listener, are going to make a podcast together. But first, today's story. I met Scott and Amy last week for coffee at the train cars. As many of you know, Train Cars Coffee and Kava is this little cafe that's right next to the carousel. It's housed in these 3 cozy little train cars that have been in Nederland since the 70s. And the cafe is super cute. They've got comfy couches and a room with a piano and a guitar, and locals will come and play and hang out. You'll see local art on the walls. They only sell locally roasted coffee. Plus, they're big purveyors in town of kava, a plant-based drink that's been used in indigenous communities for centuries to promote euphoria and a sense of well-being. And kava cafes have been popping up all over the United States as Westerners are starting to drink kava as an alternate to alcohol. But the reason that you absolutely need to go to the train cars is, yes, for all of the reasons I just mentioned, but also primarily the smell of this place. You see, the train cars fry up these little bite-sized donuts all day long, and the smell in there is absolutely incredible. So much so that it is probably caloric, but I'm not thinking about that. So last week, I'm in the caboose of a century-old train car chatting with Scott, a man who single-handedly fulfilled a lifelong dream to build and restore a carousel, and my friend Amy, who had a successful career as a dentist before she decided to leave it completely and pursue her lifelong dream of becoming an artist and community leader. She and I love to talk about the nervous system and creativity and how wonderful and magical the carousel is. Amy works at the carousel at the front desk, and she also operates the carousel as well. If you come by and you see a beautiful woman with a sparkling smile dressed in butterfly wings, that's Amy. And you'll hear more from Amy on the podcast, so I'm going to let her introduce herself properly. But for the purposes of our story, you should know I'm sitting in an old railway car, huffing donut fumes, while two dynamically positive, creative forces share their ideas for the future of the carousel. And I have to admit, dear listener, I was grumpy. Big time. I was there only because I promised to be there. I did not want to talk about ideas. I didn't want to do anything. Because when you're grumpy, ideas and possibilities and dreams, they're all, well, quite frankly, stupid. Because everything is stupid when you're grumpy. And I didn't order donuts, and I should have ordered donuts, but when you're grumpy, nothing really tastes good. So what is even the point? So, I'm grumpy, they're not, they're magical and sparkly, which means I didn't say much at first. Thankfully, as I've gotten older, I know better than to open my mouth when I'm grumpy. So I sat and I listened. And I listened to Amy share some ideas about the carousel, and Scott chimed in, and the conversation flowed as it regularly does in the carousel family toward the creative process. And Scott mentioned two details about his experience building the carousel. Details that I've heard before, but there was something about the way he said it, or more likely, how ready I was to finally receive them, that made them resonate differently within me this time. You see, the words he spoke weren't necessarily new, but I felt their meaning in a different way than I ever had. Scott reminded me of how fun the carving process was for him. When he started working on the carousel, he was doing it for himself. Yes, ultimately he wanted to share his creation with others, but the process of creating each animal was just for him. It was fun, it was relaxing, it brought him peace and calm and steadiness when he needed it. Scott would go out into his shop to carve at night, not because he felt like he should, not because he was trying to get his 10,000 hours, not because he set a New Year's resolution to do so. He went out into the shop to carve each and every night after work because it felt good. The work allowed him to use his hands. It allowed him to work on something tangible and immediate directly in front of him. Because remember, at the time, he was working at home for Amnesty International all day long. Every day he was poised to write letter after letter after letter at the drop of a hat, no matter what time it was, immediately on behalf of those being tortured halfway around the world. In the 80s and 90s, when he's working on the carousel, he isn't in Vietnam anymore, but he is still very much engaged in work that was equal parts challenging and satisfying. And having something tangible, like a piece of wood, something that allowed you to see day by day how progress is unfolding, was something very satisfying to balance his day job. So during the creative process, during the creative act of building the carousel, Scott was not focused on anyone else. He was doing it because it felt good to him. And as soon as he reminded me of that, I knew exactly what was missing in the podcast. Not necessarily the first couple of episodes, but the last two. I have to admit, dear listener, I made those for you. Not for me. I made those episodes the way that I did because I thought that's what you wanted to hear. I thought that's what you should hear. I didn't make those episodes for me. I made them for you. And No offense. That's what was wrong with them. There wasn't any spark to them, any joy. The first couple of episodes, I was following my own interest. I was following my own curiosity. I was following my own breadcrumbs, just like Scott was with the carousel. But I didn't realize that at the time. When I was making those first episodes, it just so happened that I was reading a book on the nervous system. Some of the ideas that made it into those early episodes were results of casual conversations I had in passing with family or friends. And as such, those first couple of episodes, they felt like they fell into my lap, as opposed to the last two, where the process sort of felt like pulling teeth. And I could feel it. I knew something was off, but I just went ahead anyway. Why? Well, there is a practical concern. These episodes do come out weekly, and this is my job. But more than that, I think I got caught up in what I thought you wanted, what I thought you expected. And as a result, there wasn't any me in them. There wasn't any of what lights me up, what excites me in those episodes. Because I was raised in a household where you did what your parents or your teachers told you to do, even if it didn't feel right. Because that's just what you did. You do things regularly in life you don't want to do because life is hard, and that's it. End of story. And as a little kid, every time I did something for somebody else, I was praised. I was called a good girl. I was called a team player. They gave me ribbons and stuff. And as a result, slowly, gradually, over time, I eroded my own inner guidance. The connection between me and me got garbled with all sorts of static. Other people's opinions, other people's expectations, what they wanted from me. It was all white noise blocking me from me. But that isn't what the Carousel of Happiness is about. That isn't how the Carousel of Happiness came to be. It got built because Scott was given an idea specific and unique to him. And then he followed fun step after silly step after curious step, one by one by one. Scott enjoyed the process of making the carousel. He was doing it for himself. Sure, he wanted people to ride it eventually, but on those January days when he's wading through thigh-deep snow to get outside to his workshop, he's not thinking about you or me. He's thinking about himself, how good it feels to carve animals, how good it feels to work with his hands, period. And as a result of following his own bliss, he created something for all of us. Sit with that for a second. By doing what felt good to him, what felt natural, what felt easy, Scott created something that has meaning and value for all of us. We waste so much time as human beings doing things that we think we should do or we think that people want us to do. When I believe the real service, the real juice, the real magic of life comes when we offer to the world what comes easy. That special magic contribution that we have to this world, to this lifetime, it's fun. And it's so tailored specifically for us that it almost feels like we're cheating. Because it feels like these days we equate suffering with service. We think that in order to help others, we must sacrifice ourselves. No pain, no gain, right? It's the message we see on the news. It's the message we hear from our teachers. It's what the hustle culture leads us to believe. If we are going to make a difference, it is going to be hard. It is going to be unpleasant. But what if that weren't true? What if we came to this earth absolutely and completely perfect? What if we were given the exact skill set we need to accomplish and experience everything we uniquely want in this lifetime? What if we knew there weren't any mistakes? What if we knew there weren't any accidents? What if we knew that what came easiest to us, what we loved most in the world, would lead to our legacy? It is my belief that our greatest contributions in this world can be easy. They can feel good. I believe in service and art that fuels the creator first, that allows whoever is making the thing to fill their cup up first, and then allow the excess, the overflow, to flow on toward others. That's what happened with the carousel. Scott healed himself through the act of carving animals and then allowed his overflow energy, his excess life force, to spill over for the rest of us to enjoy. And as a result, doors flew open for him. Synchronicities were everywhere. People came out of the woodwork and bent over backwards to help him, because he was in alignment with his highest and best self. He was doing what he was brought to this earth to do. Scott has said of those times, it felt like the carousel was happening to him, not because of him. It felt like he was dancing with something larger than himself. Which leads me to the next reminder Scott gave me at the train cars last week. He said, looking back on it all, so many details tied together perfectly. So many elements of the carousel were imbued with meaning that he didn't necessarily intend at the time. And the same thing was true for me in those first couple of episodes of the podcast. Those details tied together so beautifully, but I have to admit, it wasn't me. I didn't make those connections until they were literally staring me in the face. I, like Scott, had help. So many times with art, we want to know what something is before we begin. We want to know because we're human and the unknown can be scary. And in my case, the unknown could result in not having an episode for you next week. So I tried to predict. I tried to game the system, and in doing so, I dulled the magic just a bit. In the first couple of episodes, I was using any and everything in my daily life to understand Scott and the impact of the carousel. I was using details from books I was reading. I was reaching out to interview people I personally found fascinating. And in trying to put the cart before the horse, I lost a bit of that magic. Because I was afraid it wouldn't last. I was afraid the well would run dry if I didn't micromanage it. And to be quite frank, I still felt a little uncomfortable about this whole fill your own cup up first. That was something that intellectually I understood, but I didn't feel in my bones until last week. But no more, dear listener. We're going to do things a bit differently from here on out. The truth is, the intent of this podcast isn't to bring everyone up to date on the history of the Carousel of Happiness. The intent of this podcast is to explore and examine the ripple effects of the Carousel of Happiness, how Scott's work of art is, to this day, changing the lives of others, including mine. So next week, I don't know what the podcast will be about. I don't know because I'm committing to not knowing. I'm committing to being curious and following my own interests and reporting back to you. And I'm trusting that if the creative process felt good for Scott, and that what he created had such an impact on others, that the same will be true for me. And for you, dear listener, because we're doing this together. You, just by listening to this, are part of the podcast, part of the ripple effect. I encourage you to listen to this podcast and trust your inner guidance. If your inner guidance tells you to do something like call a friend or start writing a book, trust that. And if your inner guidance encourages you to reach out to me with a story you'd like to share, please do that too. Because that's how we can create something new together. Something special, something we've never seen before. Something like a 1910 carousel filled with over 50 handmade and original animals. So this week, I encourage you to follow your inner guidance, follow your fun, follow your excitement, and see where it leads. And I'll do the same. In the meantime, take care, be well, and as we like to say at the Carousel of Happiness, don't delay joy. And we'll see you next time around.
Beginnings and endings are only pretendings. I'll see you next time around.